A Baptist preacher and his wife decided to get a new dog. Ever mindful of the congregation, they knew the dog must also be a Baptist. They visited kennel after kennel and explained their needs. Finally, they found a kennel whose owner assured them that he had just the dog that they wanted. The owner brought the dog to meet the pastor and his wife. "Fetch the Bible," he commanded. The dog bounded to the bookshelf, scrutinized the books, located the Bible, brought it to the owner. "Now find Psalm 23, he commanded. The dog dropped the Bible to the floor and, showing marvelous dexterity with his paws, leafed through finding the correct passage, pointed it with his paw. The pastor and his wife were very impressed and purchased the dog. That evening, a group of church members came to visit. The pastor and his wife began to show off the dog, having him locate several Bible verses. The visitors were very impressed. One man asked, "Can he do regular dog tricks too?" "I haven't tried yet," the pastor replied. He pointed his finger at the dog. "Heel," the pastor commanded. The dog immediately jumped up on a chair, placed one paw on the pastor's forehead, and began to howl in the name of Jesus. The pastor looked at his wife in shock and said, "Good Lord, he's charismatic." There we go. So today I want to go a little bit farther than I did last week. Last week, do you remember what I talked about? This is always preparations for what? Preparations for a miracle. Preparations for increase. That's right. I'm going to start in Luke 5 again, but I'm going to take what I talked about last week is still relevant, but now I want to even make it a little bit more personal, and I want to look at the life of Peter, and I want to show how Peter's life can actually look like our life, and so if you remember in Luke 5, the story is that the disciples were actually they weren't disciples yet. The fishermen, they were hanging around the boats. They had just come in. And they were mending their nets. They were cleaning their nets. And Jesus said, "I need to use your boats." So they took them out. And then as Jesus finished speaking, he says, "Go fishing again." And the disciples, again, they weren't disciples yet. The fishermen, the boys, Peter, James, and John, and his cohorts, said, "Well, we've already been, but okay, we will, since it's you." And so they lowered their nets, and what happened was an amazing catch that the nets were breaking. And they were hauling the fish in, and the boats were sinking. And I basically, what I said was, in their abundance required more work. Oftentimes we have this mentality when abundance comes, it's actually going to require less work of me. And that's actually a poverty mentality. Poverty mentality says I have to do less to get more. And I don't want to do more. So I'm just content with what I have. It's this twisted mindset of what abundance looks like. So Jesus was constantly, at that point. Sorry, I'm just going to back up. So that's what the start of this was, and then Jesus actually called Peter, and in Matthew. Here we go back to Matthew. In Luke, after this whole story. Peter came to Jesus and bowed before him, and Jesus said to him, "From now on, you're going to catch men for salvation." And if you're a single woman, that's exactly what you want to hear Jesus say to you. Sorry, couldn't resist. But after pulling their boats to shore, they left everything behind and followed Jesus. Now, someone came up to me last week and said, I have a hard time grasping why God would call the men out and to follow him and leave their families alone. And I said, I've struggled with that too. But I really believe that the abundance that they caught that day supplied all of that family's needs for the time that the men were away. But they also had associates and people. And I believe that the business continued even though the heads of that business necessarily were away. And so in that provision, in that calling, there was still provision for the ones left at home. And so I don't believe that as a family that God ever wants to separate us without leaving us provided for. And that's part of this beautiful picture of the family that God has set up, that even though they left, there was still provision. And I believe that call gave them enough money to ease them on through. So that's just an aside. But again, that is simply my opinion and the opinion of me. It doesn't necessarily but I just feeling that I know God's heart, that was something that he did for them. So after that point, Jesus said, follow. And you remember I said last week, it was like, when we follow Jesus, how do we know that we're following Jesus? Is that he's actually ahead of us. That he's not beside us, that he's not behind us. There's a story in the Bible when the guys were walking and the writer in the gospel specifically said Jesus stopped and ministered. Jesus stopped. And so when Jesus stopped, the disciples stopped. And in order to follow something, someone, it requires us to be engaged, right? The disciples, as Jesus called out the disciples and said, you, follow me. Yo, Matthew, follow me. Peter, follow me. What was Jesus doing? He was actually setting up a method of his disciples learning from Jesus, understanding what he was doing, maybe understanding, not necessarily understanding all the time, because the disciples had questions, but they actually had to physically do something, and they stepped out and they followed what Jesus was doing. And they followed Jesus. Because what was Jesus here for? Jesus was here to highlight the kingdom, to show off his Father's kingdom. He came to heal the sick. He came to raise the dead, to cast out demons, and to declare freedom to the captives. Right? And so in a way he was saying, this is my Father's kingdom, and now I'm here. Now I'm going to show you what it is all about. I'm going to show you what my Father's kingdom is, and then you're going to actually then copy what I'm doing. That's what following does. Is we mask, not mask. Maybe I can use the word mask. We mimic. It's a better word. We mimic what the person is we're following. How many of us often find, like in this day and age of social media and stuff, the more we get caught up in statuses on Twitter or Instagram or something, we actually find ourselves thinking like the person we follow. Because sometimes, and if you don't, then this analogy is lost on you, but on Twitter, the more you follow one person and if they tweet a lot, their sayings come out and you actually start thinking about what they tweet and maybe even copying and paste and put it on. And it's like, that's what they want. They want their message to go out. Well, the same thing can be said for us as we're following Jesus, is that we copy and we paste the things that Jesus said and does. Whether it be literally on a computer and our Facebook posts. A lot of us do that. I open up my Facebook in the morning and it's just with Christian sayings, with Bible verses, with whatever. There's nothing wrong with that, right? It's just because it's something you have engaged in and you want to share that. I love that saying. I post a lot of Bill Johnson and Sean Bowles and Jonathan Welton. Those are my three people that I really enjoy. And so I find myself copying and pasting or sharing or whatever, much to other people's... anyway, we're not going to go there. But that's this whole thing, and that's what Jesus was doing. He was setting up this group of men in Luke 5. And he says, follow me. And so Jesus always, he was constantly reaching out to the marginalized people. He was constantly reaching out to the poor, to the widows, to the people who were in bondage. He was healing the sick. And as he led the disciples, as he led them, as they were following him, he was showing them, okay, this is what I want you to do. And so in the 3 years that Jesus was around leading these guys were actually becoming transformed into the likeness of Jesus. Right? They were actually learning to do the things that Jesus did. And then it came to a point about halfway in his ministry, he's like, okay, guys, you've been with me for a while now. Now go out and do this. We can find that in a couple of places in the Gospels where he's sent out. And then when they came back, they were all excited because they got it. And Jesus was like, yes, you did. But look at this. Like there's one asked, like, you got it, but don't rejoice in what all you just did. Rejoice that actually you believe. That your name is written in the book of life now. That you're actually part of this family. That's even better. Being connected into family, being connected into who I am. What you do is less important as who you are in me. But at the same time, he's like, still, like, that's amazing. Like people, like the demons left and the people were healed. And Jesus is like, yay, that's amazing. So if we get back into the life of Peter, how many of us realize that a lot of us, if not all of us, have aspects of Peter in us? I know I do a lot. I tend to say what I think too often. Right, Dan? And the older we get, the more filters we get, or the less filters we get, depending. Dan's like, I am just really afraid. By the time you're 70, what's going to come out of your mouth? And I was like, you married me, for better or for worse. But I actually have found that my filters are better. They're a little bit stronger than they were when I was 20. Right? See, there's hope. There's hope. So then if you go, if we're looking at, let's look at Luke 22. This is the story of when Jesus had died, he had risen again. The ladies went to the tomb. And so everything was in disarray. How would you feel if the person that you were following, that you were just devoted to, that you were totally engaged with for 3 years, was suddenly dead? And you didn't quite get the story of that, hey, he's going to die, but he's going to come back. It was Jesus talking about the death and the resurrection of himself kind of ranked up there. If you eat my body and you drink my blood, they didn't get it. For us, we understand what Jesus is talking to because we've had because we have 2,000 years of translation, right? Jesus saying, eat my body, drink my blood, and I'm going to die and resurrect. We're like, Jesus, thank you. They didn't get it. They didn't know. All that they knew is that they knew the voice of Jesus, that they knew who he was, and he was good and he brings life. That's all they could hang on to. And that's why when Jesus had that popular sermon, that if it was a podcast today, it wouldn't get listened to. It was that, drink my body, drink my blood, eat my body. And everybody left. And he looked and he says to the ones that stayed, are you going to deny me too? And Peter said, who else are we going to follow? Your words bring life. Your words bring us truth. Who else is there? In other words, if there was another option, they would have done it. If Peter had another option, he would have gone for it. But who else is there? I had no other choice. I can go fishing again, but that didn't work out first time, right? And so here we are at the tomb, and the women went to the tomb, and the angel said, he's not here, and the Son of Man is destined to be handed over to sinful men to be nailed on the cross. All at once they remembered his words. Leaving the tomb, they went to break the news to the 11 and to all the others of what they had seen and heard. And this is verse 11, 24, Luke 24. When the disciples heard the testimony of the women, it made no sense. I'm just going to leave that one alone. And they were unable to believe what they heard. Then, but verse 12, but Peter jumped up, ran the entire distance to the tomb to see for himself. Stooping down, he looked inside and discovered it was empty. There was only the linen sheet lying there. Staggered by this, he walked away, wondering what it meant. He still didn't get it. You know, he had gone through all of this stuff. He had denied Jesus. Peter was so vocal, he was so alive, like he did things. Peter was the type of guy that went, ready, fire, aim. Did I hit it? He was always, he's like, was I supposed to aim for that? Jesus says, go out and buy a sword, and Peter's like, okay, I got a sword. And so the guys come to arrest Jesus, and he used the sword. Cut off the guy's ear, and Jesus is like, what the heck? Picks up the ear, puts it back on the servant, and Peter's like, well, you told me to buy a sword, so I just assumed that you want me to use it. She said, buy a sword, don't use the sword. So this is who Peter is. Right? He's like over and over again so excited and so out there that he just wants to do it all. Mm-hmm. And then they're in the garden. And let's look at that. It's in sorry, that was I lost mine. Sorry, Luke. I said Luke 22, didn't I?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Luke. So this is where. So they're in the garden. I jumped ahead. I was referring to Luke 24. Sorry, I was wondering why it wasn't going as easy as I thought it was. But Luke 22 is when they were in the garden, and Jesus says to Peter, "You love me, right? Yeah, but you're going to deny me 3 times." And Peter's like, "You're funny. I would never deny you." Where's that now? 57? Well, that's Peter's denial. Where does Jesus tell? I'm sorry, I thought I had this one written down. I'm sorry, we don't. Anyway, we know the story. I'm sorry, I forgot to grab the. But we know Peter said, or Jesus says to Peter, "You're going to deny me," and he's like, "No." And so then what happens is that no sooner had he finished speaking when suddenly a mob approached. Right? And then Judas betrays Jesus. So the religious leader seized Jesus and led him away, but Peter followed from a safe distance. So all of a sudden, for the first time in Peter's life, he was afraid. He let fear step in and seep in to his mentality. Up until that point, he was fully devoted and fully engaged with the ways of love. And he wanted just the best. Even in his zeal, he would do things wrong, but fear was not a motivator. And all of a sudden, the one that he followed, the one that he was committed to, the one that he had been following for 3 years was gone, and fear crept in, and he embraced fear. And the religious leader seized Jesus and led him away. They brought him to the home of the high priest, and they went, and they did what they did to Jesus. Someone had built a fire, so Peter inched closer and sat down among them to stay warm. A girl noticed Peter sitting in the firelight. Staring at him, she pointed him out and said, "That man is one of Jesus' disciples." Peter flatly denied it, saying, "What are you talking about, girl? I don't know him." A little while later, someone else pointed at Peter and said, "I recognize you. You're one of his. I know it." Peter said, "I am not one of his disciples." An hour later, someone else identified Peter and insisted that he was a disciple of Jesus, saying, "Look at him, he's from Galilee, just like Jesus. I know he's one of them." And here's an interesting thing was, they knew that he was a disciple because he looked like Jesus. What happens when we follow Jesus? What happens when we are actually following and engaging with Jesus? We begin to look like Jesus. It's the way we talk, the way we conduct ourselves, the way it's like there's something different about him. But Peter was adamant. Listen, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you understand? I don't even know it. While the words were still in his mouth, the rooster crowed. And at that moment, the Lord, who was being led through the courtyard by his captor, turned around, gazed at Peter. All at once, Peter remembered the word of Jesus had prophesied over him. Before the rooster crows in the morning, you will deny 3 times that you even know me. Peter then burst into tears, ran off from the crowd, and wept bitterly. So this is almost like the fall of Peter, right? And so then we go forward and into Luke 24. I already talked about that because that was what I messed up. But Peter jumped up after hearing the words, and he still didn't get it. But something in Peter was so engaged in him when he heard that the Lord was resurrected. He wanted to make things right. And he was almost like, it's too good to be true. He was the first. He jumped up and ran, got to the tomb and saw the empty tomb and was like, something's just not right. And it says he's staggered by this. He walked away wondering what it meant. So then we're going to look at John 21. John 21 is the story of Jesus appearing in the Lake of Galilee. It says after the resurrection. And we're just going to read it, and I'm just going to pull off a few things here. Later, Jesus appeared once again to the group of his disciples by Lake Galilee. It happened one day while Peter, Thomas, the twin, Nathanael, Jacob, John, and 2 other disciples were all together. Peter told them, I'm going fishing. And they all replied, we'll go with you too. So they went out and they fished throughout the night and caught nothing. Then at dawn, Jesus was standing there by the shore, but the disciples didn't realize that it was him. He called out to them saying, hey guys, catch any fish? And actually, I learned this week that in this passage, I think it's a Greek verb, it was a sarcastic comment. It's like, you're not catching anything, are you? That's how it was originally written. It's like, you're not catching anything, are you? Because it seems like when the disciples were without Jesus, they caught nothing. If you think about back to Luke 5, they were out there, they fished all night, they caught nothing, and Jesus said, cast your nets. And when they obeyed Jesus, the nets were filled. So here you go, 3 years later, after following Jesus, after having let down, Peter and the guys went back to the only thing that they knew. They reverted back to their old way of thinking. They reverted back to their old patterns. And they went back to fish. Not catching anything, are you? Not a thing, they replied. Jesus shouted at them, throw your net over on the starboard side, and you'll catch some. And so they did as he said, and they caught so many fish they couldn't even pull in the net. So it was before they caught enough fish to get it in, but the nets were breaking. This time it was a greater harvest that they couldn't even get the nets in. Then the disciple who Jesus loved, so that would be John, because this is his book. And the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the Lord! When Peter heard him say that, he quickly wrapped his outer garment around him, and because he was athletic, he dove right into the lake, which is the first thing you want to do when you go swimming, is to get dressed, to go to Jesus. The other disciples then brought the boat to the shore, dragging their catch of fish. They weren't far from land, only about 300 meters. And when they got to shore, they noticed that a charcoal fire with some roasted fish and bread was prepared for them. Then Jesus said, bring some of the fish you just caught. So Peter waded to the water, helped pull the net to shore. It was full of many large fish, exactly 153. But even with so many fish, the net wasn't torn. So the first time the nets were taxed. The second time the nets were intact. Very interesting. Very interesting the fact that in the process of preparing for abundance, we gain strength. In the process of following Jesus, our capacity and our strength for having capacity is strengthened and not taxed. So Jesus said to them, "Come, let's have some breakfast." Jesus said, and not one of the disciples needed to ask who it was, because every one of them knew it was the Lord. Then Jesus came close to them and served them the bread and the fish. This was the first time that Jesus appeared to his disciples after his resurrection. So Peter was so enamored with Jesus and loved Jesus so much, and yet had this guilt and this shame on him that he reverted back to what he used to know. That it was a natural inclination just to go back, well, that didn't work, but this will because, hey, I paid the bills before. So he sees Jesus. He's like, oh, he is alive. And something broke in him alive again. Hope was restored. Life was restored. And that's why I think his first response was to jump into the lake and get to him before anybody else could. Because he needed to have a face-to-face with Jesus. After they had breakfast, Jesus said to Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you burn with love for me more than these?" Interesting comment. Do you love me more than these other guys? Peter answered, "Yes. Yes, Lord, you know that I have great affection for you. Then take care of my lambs," Jesus said. Jesus repeated his question the second time. "Simon, son of John, do you burn with love for me?" "Yes, my Lord. You know that I have great affection for you. And take care of my sheep." Jesus asked him again, "Peter, son of John, do you have great affection for me?" Peter was saddened. He was thinking, something's not right. Something's not... He keeps asking me the same question. Maybe he's mad at me for denying him. Something's not kosher in my heart. Being sad, he asked the third time, he says, "My Lord, you know everything. You know that I burn with love for you." Jesus replied, "Then feed my lambs." Peter, listen to me. When you were younger, you made your own choices. And you went where you pleased. But one day when you're old, others will tie you up and escort you where you will not choose to go. And you will spread out your arms. Jesus said this to Peter as a prophecy of the kind of death that he would die for the glory of God. And then he said, "Peter, follow me." See, this is a story of redemption. This is a story of reminder. This is a story of coming full circle. That God calls us, we follow him, we go through life, we go through doing our things. Sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes we take a route that isn't necessarily his plan A. But you know what I've found? He's got several plan A's for us. There is no plan B, C's, D's in the kingdom. He's got like, this is Jeff's life. I've got 5 plan A's. Because things don't work like we think in reality in the kingdom. We think in plan A, B, C, D, E. God's like plan A, plan A, plan A, plan A. Oh, let's see what's going to happen. But I really honestly believe, as far as even though we have free will, that God actually brings us to points where he eliminates choices so that the only thing that we can choose at times is him. He eliminates these instances and goes, "Oh, that's okay, this is great, do this." And that's what he did with Peter. Peter went through his entire 3 years with Jesus, making mistakes, and Jesus is loving on him. Brings him back full circle, he's fishing, and he's like, "Throw it over." And he's like, "This sounds really familiar. What's going on?" And then Jesus restores him. And he says, "Peter, follow me." And he's like, "Yeah." Could you imagine what just went on in Peter's heart? Could you imagine how this affects us today as we realize that as we come full circle from the time that Christ called us and said, follow me? How many of us have made mistakes? How many of us have made choices that are not conducive necessarily to a life of following Jesus? And he's like, "You know what? Do you want to follow me? Am I still ahead of you? Are all the other options just paling?" You know, there's that old hymn, "And the things of earth will go strangely dim." Theologically, I'm not whatever, but it just came to mind. The things of earth will grow strangely dim in the what? In the eyes? Light of his glory and grace. Right? It's like that becomes what we want. That's what we need. How do we follow Jesus? We follow him by following him. By looking at the Bible, looking at the words, listening to prophetic words, saying, this is who I am, this is what I want to do, this is what I've got to do. My heart burns for what he wants. I think a lot of us don't realize that we're actually not following Jesus because we're not being transformed into Jesus. That's hard. I know that sounded way harsher than I meant it to sound. But I think there's truth there. That if our life is not becoming transformed by the power of his presence, if there's areas of our life that are not being transformed, then are we actually following him? We could be following something else with good intentions. And he's like, but you know what? But I'm calling you now. I'm calling you back now. I've brought you back full circle. Peter went full circle. And then there was a transformation in Peter's life that actually transformed the face of the earth. See, when Jesus called him and asked him, feed my sheep, feed my lambs, there's types of sheep that we don't see in the English. In the Aramaic and the Greek, it was rams, it was sheep, and it was ewes. Ewe? Is that how you say it? Ewes. And what Jesus was actually saying to Peter was, you need to go to the Gentiles, you need to go to the Jews, and you need to go to the rest of the world. And you need to feed them. And you need to become a shepherd. And you need to be one who loves, because I'm one who loves, and I'm one who was called for the entire world. And his life was changed. Because the Peter we see in the Gospels leading up to this point is not the Peter we see afterwards. He was changed. And he took his call and he followed Jesus. Oh. So I believe that God is calling us full circle. He shows us our progress, and he gives us the opportunity then to engage, to re-engage. And I think at times we look back on our lives and we go, I've done this, I am disqualified for following Jesus now. Or I may not be disqualified for following Jesus, but I'm certainly disqualified of doing anything for him. And that's garbage. That's a lie that the enemy wants to say to us. To say, who are you? It's the same lie the enemy spoke to Jesus in the wilderness. If you are the Son of God, do this. If you are who you say you are, do this. You can't do that. You're not who you say you are. And that same lie is spoken to us because the enemy will use what we've done, and we go, no, I am actually been forgiven. I am covered. I am redeemed. I am following Jesus. I am actually becoming like him because my heart is engaged with what Jesus is. There is nothing that can disqualify you because of something that happened in your past or something you chose to do. If God has called you, then he has a plan A for you. I don't care what the situation is. I honestly don't. There are denominations out there that will disqualify you for being divorced. Garbage. There's religions out there that would say if you are a drug addict, you're done. If you're a homosexual, if you're done, you can't. You blah, blah. Nothing. The Jesus that I see in the Bible never disqualified anybody for doing anything as long as they were following him and their hearts were engaged in his love. Because it's in his love we are engaged. It's in his love we are changed. It's in his love that changes us to love others. And it's time for us to rise up and going, no, I am deciding to follow Jesus. And I'm not going to sing the old song. Those of you who are old enough going, oh, Jesus. Those of you who are too young are like, what did he just say? Shoot, that just put me in the category. We are all part of what God has called us to do. And wherever we're at, if our hearts are to follow him, we will actually change the world around us. And we actually are discipling. And we actually disciple people because of who we are. I had a coaching session this week with Bethel, and he asked me, he says, what's your discipleship program look like? I hate questions like that. I hate them. requires me to actually, and I told him, I said, I hate you. He goes, what? I said, I hate questions like that. I said, we don't have a discipleship program. Discipleship isn't a program. It's a way of life. It is actually, as we follow, Jesus didn't have a sit down with 12 guys every morning and go, okay, what's the sin in your life? Okay, how are you doing this? No, he did life together. It's like, hey, Peter, do you got any toilet paper? I need some. It was life. What do you like on your eggs? Hey, I don't like it when you make that. It was life. That's how they did discipleship. They changed by hanging out, by doing life together. That's what I told my coach. I'm like, we have discipleship at House of Hope because we hang out together and we act like Jesus. We try to. Sometimes we don't, and it doesn't go well. But we're trying. Right? That's discipleship. We've turned discipleship into a 4-letter word that nobody wants to do because it's so impersonal. Jesus was the most personal person on the earth as God, as man, and he drew people in, and it was through relationship, and that's how we grow. Yeah. We are all sitting here today as a result of somebody discipling us. Yes. He goes, I've never once sat in a class. That's okay, because you were discipled, because you followed somebody who's following Jesus, and you're stronger today. And it's natural, it's organic, it's tree hugging. I'm just kidding. But it's natural and it's organic. And that's how we do it here. So he looks at me, he goes, that's awesome, I love that. But it's true, right? I've been stuck in studies with men this was a discipleship class. Or I'm like, that is just, I don't like it, as you can tell. But we always have to come to the point where we realize that Jesus is with us all the time. The funny thing is that when the guys were on the boat and they didn't know that it was Jesus, he was always there. And it wasn't until Jesus spoke out loud that their perception changed and he was there. It's just like, remember at Easter I said when Mary came to the tomb and Jesus was there in one of the stories and Jesus spoke her name, everything went. The fear, everything that was not right went. And he cleared the air by speaking her name and she was engaged. It was the same thing with Peter. He spoke and Peter's like, it's the Lord. How many times have we been in a situation in our life we're going, I haven't heard from Jesus in months. God doesn't speak to me anymore. I'm in the middle of a crazy situation. God, where are you? And all of a sudden he goes, Jeff, you're here. He speaks our names. He clears the air. And we're like, and so we have to take from that it doesn't matter what situation we are in. We cannot use our own perception as gospel. We have to know that we know that Jesus is right next to us. That he's there. We may not hear him. We may not understand that it's him. There's a guy standing here and we look at him and we're like, I don't know who that guy is. Until he turns and he speaks and you go, I know that name. I know that voice. I know that. I know that the tone. I know that tone. That tone just cleared something in my heart. I know that. So we can't go by our feelings. We can't go by our perception of the circumstance. We have to look for his voice and look for his face. Because if he's not moving and we can't see him, we should actually stop until we can actually find him again. And we don't do anything until he moves. Anyway, I think I'm done. Just boom. I could go on, but I won't. Because you tell me a little bit passionate about this. I truly believe that he's called us, and for a number of us, it's a full circle. He's bringing us back to the point where we're potentially going back to what we know. And he's like, no, I've still called you to do this. It's just that I prepared you even more. Because that's process. It's knowing whose we are and knowing who we are. So let's stand again. Here we go. I'm going to go preaching again. It's not even 12 o'clock. Look at that. I don't even smell lunch. Does anybody smell lunch?
No, it's sandwiches.
It's sandwiches. Yeah, it's a good thing we don't smell lunch. Let's pray. Stick your hand on your heart if you want to, or top of your head, or I want you to just lay hands on yourself. Say, Jesus, I choose to follow you. I choose to, back up. Yeah. I choose to follow you. Whatever that looks like. Come and get me. Amen. All right. Bless you guys. We'll see you tonight. We are continuing on our Foundations of Honor.